Okay, if I could invite you all to please take your seats, we'll begin momentarily.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second to last day. How did that happen? We're already at the second to last day of our summer seminar. And it is my pleasure this morning to introduce to you Professor James Matthew Wilson. He comes to us from the university. Well, he was formerly at Villanova, now at the University of St. Thomas, University of St. Thomas in Houston, where he is professor of English literature, but also has founded a master's program in fine arts. Professor Wilson, like us, writes in prose, but in addition, unlike us, he writes in poetry, being a distinguished American Catholic poet. He will address us on the subject of gratitude and the reception of tradition. Professor Wilson.
Thank you, John, and thank you, everyone. It's wonderful to be back in Steubenville with all of you. I've spoken for the Hildebrand seminars in the past, but never actually here, thanks to you-know-what. And then, of course, I've also gotten to speak in this room before because I'm very pleased that Franciscan and I have worked together, and I have an imprint with Franciscan University Press, the Coliseum Books, which publishes contemporary poetry and literary criticism. Franciscan is the publisher, so we've occasionally had events in here. For those of you who were here last night, which I hope was everybody, we heard Mikhail and John Henry last night speak about gratitude in music. And the challenge they set for themselves was fairly daunting. How can, at least if we're going to follow Kant down this path, how can the non-conceptual formal structures of music be expressive of the substance of something, of gratitude? It's hard enough, although we heard it last night, to conceive of poetry as, say, expressing the sunrise, but how does it give expression to this otherwise unrepresentable and interior condition or activity that may be gratitude? Note that I said condition, but also activity, because I think Dr. Stump's address yesterday was very important in clarifying for us that gratitude is not fundamentally this posterior giving of thanks that too often can ring hollow. It's actually a matter of orienting ourselves as persons to being, to the world, and finally to God. I set a different sort of challenge for myself in my remarks today, and that's this. Rather than contemplate how, as it were, the material reality, the substance of gratitude could find expression in works of poetry, I wanted to take a more formal approach. And what I mean by formal here is it might be expressed in a twofold terms. And forgive me for indulging this sort of preamble a little bit, but this is something I've been reflecting about, and I realized I'd never articulated before. What is it that drives a lot of the arguments I try to make? And here I think it is. Many of you will know Maurice Blondel's theories of action and his account of apologetics, and the famous distinction he makes between the intrinsic and the extrinsic. That extrinsicism is a way, you might say, of as I would say as a follower of Aquinas, is a way of arguing from certain material facts or realities to try to make what's really a philosophical or a theological claim. And for Blondel, this was deemed utterly insufficient. The only way in which to genuinely explain and to justify a belief must be rooted in the intrinsic, from which category he's really borrowing from Immanuel Kant. The idea that what are, for Kant, the subjective conditions of possibility that make it possible for us to make a claim about truth or something like that. For Blondel, for those of you who don't know his work in particular, an example of an intrinsicist argument for, say, the truths of Christianity would be that which we find in Blaise Pascal's Pensées, which I am thinking of just because it was his birthday last week, where for Pascal, there's nothing outside you in the universe that actually would lead you to belief in God. To the contrary, God is hidden outside you. But if you look inward, the interior properties of your being themselves disclose the necessity of faith in God. And so it's that interior exploration, that psychological, or as other people might put it, that existential exploration of the nature of belief that made Pascal such a compelling person. Now, I'm no Pascalian, and I don't think, as he seems to have done, that when we look around ourselves, we see nothing but a wasteland and an abyss. I think, to the contrary, we see a celestial hierarchy and a great chain of being and signs of God's presence everywhere. But what I find compelling about Pascal, Blondel, and even in this one particular instance, Immanuel Kant, is the desire to look at philosophical questions from what a Thomist would call the formal perspective rather than the material perspective. As a poet, this makes for a particularly daunting task. How could gratitude formally inform poetic practice? Is there a formal role, as opposed to a material one, for gratitude in any kind of tradition-based activity that would include not only poetic practice, but also the practice of philosophy and theology? So to explore this, I'm going to take 4 pathways, each of which builds on the other, but if they feel a little bit episodic, that's kind of on purpose, because I think I'm actually struggling to arrive at a way of addressing these things formally. So here are the 4 parts of what I'm going to share with you this morning, possibly 5, time allowing. The first one will be to revisit an argument I made a few years ago in the pages of Communio on Alistair MacIntyre, T.S. Eliot, and the idea of tradition and poetic traditions. What do poetic traditions tell us about the practice of philosophy, and vice versa? And then I want to turn in the second sort of series of remarks to different accounts of tradition, or ways of talking about tradition-related activities, and to see what, if any, gratitude's place is there. And there you're going to hear significant kinship between my remarks and Professor Stump's, not only because pietas will be coming up, but also because Dante is going to be a focus of attention. And Eliot will return there as well. He'll return in part 3 when I turn to Dante as an example of gratitude in the tradition, and look at Eliot and actually Harold Bloom, if you know that literary critic, for just a few moments. And then finally, time allowing, I want to try to take 3, maybe 4 pathways looking at actual poetic practice to see if there's a way to enter into the question of gratitude by way of referring to the poet Ivor Winters and his disciples, the Harlem Renaissance poet Claude McKay, the poet Richard Wilbur, and here's where it's really time allowing. Since John Crosby's introduction gave me leave, I'm going to try to switch from prose to verse for you, and possibly recite a couple poems of my own, and think about, in hopes that they will illuminate something about the nature of gratitude. So, to Eliot and MacIntyre, here's where we begin. In the article I published a few years ago, it was one of those scholarly essays that you really take delight in beginning, because it was able to begin with an anecdote. A friend of mine many years ago was a scholar in residence at Notre Dame, and before he packed up his books to move off to Hillsdale College to begin teaching, he took all his MacIntyre books and literally reached across an office cubicle divider where Alistair MacIntyre was finishing up his career at Notre Dame after a lifetime of having an actual office. And he said, "Dr. MacIntyre, would you sign these books for me?" MacIntyre graciously did so. As he opened up the first one to the title page, he looked up at my friend and said, "T.S. Eliot taught me to sign books this way." And he crossed out the name on the title page, wrote in his name, and then dated it and handed the book back to him. What an amazing moment that is, especially if you want to do, as I would like to do with you, to think about the idea of tradition. MacIntyre learned how to sign books from Eliot, but where did Eliot get this practice? He probably had no idea. I know the answer, but you're going to have to ask in the question and answer session if you want to find out what it's for. It's better if it's left for at least the moment as a mystery, because it's handed down without knowing quite where it's come from. This anecdote led me into exploring something that I'm kind of surprised had not been attended to before, which is Eliot. If anybody knows anything about Eliot as critic, they will know his great essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, which you all had an opportunity to read if you hadn't before in the packet. And it's probably the most important literary critical essay of the 20th century. And it is nothing if not a radically revised account of what it means to participate as a poet in a literary tradition. MacIntyre, who many of you will know from perhaps all of his books, but his most famous single book is the 1980 classic of philosophy, After Virtue, where MacIntyre first advanced the argument that reasoning, as liberal thought often proposes, with a view from nowhere, is a non-starter, is an actual impossibility, and is an act of deception, and he wouldn't put it quite this way, is even a kind of ingratitude. MacIntyre argues in that book that reasoning, and he's specifically thinking about moral reasoning, but other writings of his suggest that we can introduce this as a broader category, that reasoning as such is tradition dependent. And so MacIntyre too, 60 years after Eliot, gives us a radical revision of the nature of tradition. What's remarkable, 60 years apart though they are, is that their accounts of tradition are in fact virtually identical. And I won't go into the full argument. I just want to offer just enough to give you a sense of the argument here, how where they find a certain kinship. The way I would put it is that both of them re-articulate the idea of tradition as in terms of the possession of a language. What does that mean? Well, Eliot and MacIntyre both begin from a familiar assumption that tradition is, as it were, the dead hand of the past, clutching and clinging to the present. Or it's a mere passive receptivity of the present to the past that might receive something whole and feel obliged to just maintain it and keep it. And we'll see later in my remarks that Joseph Pieper gives this as one of several possible accounts of what a tradition is. But Eliot and MacIntyre give us, as I said earlier, a radically revised account of tradition. I'll be sharing the passages from Eliot where he does this most beautifully in just a few moments, so I'll focus on MacIntyre for just a moment. MacIntyre argues that a tradition is an ongoing argument that begins with common premises and where objections are raised within the tradition so that the terms or the premises of that tradition can be queried and revised. in this, it's like a language. It would be impossible to argue if you didn't have a language. And if you say, well, I'm going to step outside of English for a moment, in the sense of stepping outside of language per se, far from being able to give us a more compelling argument, you would simply be rendered mute. And so MacIntyre's argument is that there is an internal coherence to the ongoing kinds of arguments people conduct, and that the tradition of the argument actually makes it possible for the argument to be fruitful. Well, we say, that kind of sounds obvious when you put it that way. What would be the alternative? Well, the alternatives would be something like this. One would be the liberal argument that you can make arguments just by a pure disinterested reason standing outside of any conditions, without premises and without any dependence on the articulation of the problem you're addressing, the question you're addressing beforehand. This is self-deception, MacIntyre shows. Liberalism is itself a tradition. It's a tradition that claims no tradition, that it has no tradition. But there are other possible problems. If reason is tradition dependent, that means in order to be reasonable, you must be standing in a tradition. But as the liberal account of things shows us, it's possible to think you are arguing without a tradition, to deny what must in fact be the case. And I don't doubt that people who make those arguments are doing so in good faith, but that means that they're blind to something that nonetheless governs their decision-making and their thinking and their reasoning. And this, for MacIntyre, is actually essentially the point. His argument is that if reason is tradition-dependent, then you must really consciously grasp the source, origin, and history of that tradition in order to be able to argue well within it. This is one of the reasons that MacIntyre's books have such a curious structure, especially for someone who's trained in analytic philosophy, because they often move back and forth from a history to an argument, and then from the argument back to a history. What he's recognizing is the narrative dependence of our reasoning, the tradition dependence of our reasoning. If, and I think I heard it whispered in the crowd, if we forget part of a tradition, then we become like those strange creatures in the dystopian novel A Canticle for Leibowitz, where we have the disassembled fragments of a tradition. And in The Canticle for Leibowitz, it's all the fragments left over from the world or from the historical practice of modern science. And we have these fragments, a page of Newton here, a little bit of the calculus there, little Descartes, little Bacon, little Einstein, and we have these fragments and we say, look, this is scientific rationality. And we take those fragments as if they were synchronic rather than diachronic, as if they had no history, and we try to reassemble them into a perfectly coherent whole. And suddenly we produce things like the theological calculus of Sir Isaac Newton, things that just don't make sense. It seems to make sense to us because we're assembling the fragments as if we were trying to reassemble a jigsaw puzzle, not realizing that the jigsaw puzzle should have depth, that it has a history. So if we lose sight of the history, the tradition of our reasoning, we actually become incoherent to ourselves. We become self-deceptive, as the liberal would say, but then we also lose the ability to reason properly. Hence, MacIntyre's great argument to return to the very foundations of moral reasoning in Aristotle's Ethics, and to recognize that the ethics actually constituted and conditioned the tradition of moral philosophy, and to forget Aristotle, to pretend that you could do morality without the ethics, is effectively to render yourself not mute, but a creature of creating incoherent gibberish. On this point, incidentally, MacIntyre and T.S. Eliot were in complete agreement, because if MacIntyre was a product of the rise of the tradition of analytic philosophy in the British Academy, T.S. Eliot popped in there very briefly right at the start of the First World War and went away as quickly as he could, writing decades later in his introduction to Joseph Pieper's Leisure, the Basis of Culture, the first English edition of which was assembled by Eliot and published by him. He says of the early days of analytic philosophy, oh gosh, how does it go exactly? It was clear they were committed to seeing how much philosophy you could do without any accumulation of wisdom. That's a sick burn. So Eliot and MacIntyre show us that we are tradition-dependent creatures. MacIntyre in moral philosophy, and then later just writ large. Eliot's more specific in his attention to poetry, but I think, as with MacIntyre, his account of the poetic tradition actually has lessons for how we function as tradition-dependent creatures more generally. So let me just share, I think I have 3 choice passages for you from the essay you all would have read, Tradition and the Individual Talent. Here's one, the most obviously important one. Tradition is a matter of much wider significance, he says. Much wider significance than just the sort of passive receptivity of what's been done before, being traditional. It cannot be inherited, and if you want it, you must obtain it at great labor. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense, which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his 25th year. And the historical sense involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling that the whole of literature of Europe from Homer, and within it, the whole of the literature of his own country has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. This historical sense, which is a sense of the timeless as well as the temporal, is what makes a writer traditional. And it is at the same time what makes a writer most acutely conscious of his place in time, of his contemporaneity. There's much here. The idea of writing with the bones of a tradition in you, I think, is very perceptive. In discussing the history of poetic practice over the years, one of the ways in which I've described what it means to be an artist in the present is that you walk into a well-appointed room like this one, full of the bric-a-brac of your tradition, works of art, a fully appointed, well-furnished room. And your contribution, if you're, say, a Shakespeare, is to look at a cigar box on the table and say, no, that would look better angled this way. And that's your contribution as an artist. So there's very little room for what's often called creativity in the arts. It's actually about rearranging the pre-existent parts so that something new comes into being. Eliot will put it this way. This is not a passage I'm going to quote in full, but he has a woman say, well, how can we look upon the works of the past as having authority? We know so much more than they did. To which Eliot replies, exactly, they are that which we know. So the present is always, as Augustine might have put it, like an onion skin bit more thick than the past. It's just a new contribution containing the past. Here's another suggestion from Eliot. No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation, is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead. And I mean this as a principle of aesthetic, not merely historical criticism. In the first passage I read, Eliot and MacIntyre converge perfectly in the following way. They see that tradition-dependent rationality and the tradition-dependent practice of an artist requires a conscious grasp. If it's unconscious, then we become like the liberal who thinks there's no tradition, or we become like the figures in Canticle for Leibowitz who are aware of a tradition but only grasp it poorly because they're not doing so consciously and steadfastly enough. In this one, we see that, in fact, any new statement we make is conditioned by the language that is the tradition in which we speak. And so it's impossible to make sense of a sentence if you don't have, as it were, the tradition of the as language, as dictionary to guide your understanding of the sentence. And then here, one third and final passage, a beautiful one. The necessity that he, the artist, shall conform, that he shall cohere is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art that preceded it. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the new, the really new work of art among them. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For the order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly, altered. And so the relations, proportions, values of each work of art toward the whole are readjusted. And this is conformity between the old and the new. Eliot was a brilliant and myriad-minded man, but he's not that hard to figure out what he's up to. And this is a passage he writes or was writing at the same time he was at work on his poem, The Wasteland. And many of you, even if you've tried and failed to read that poem, will at least remember the beginning of, late in part one of the poem. Our narrator crosses London Bridge and sees all the bankers going through the early morning light across London Bridge to the banking district. And then the poem suddenly erupts with this line: "So many, I had not known death had undone so many." And of course, where does that line come from? This is one of the 100 lines that Eliot quotes wholly or in part from other poets. It's from Dante. This is what Dante says when he sees all the sinners hastening towards the river Styx to cross in Charon's boat. And so what has just happened there? No one will ever read Dante's Inferno again without remembering that Eliot applied that line to 20th century London. And it's bourgeois dead souls. So the present has actually changed and reconstituted the past, just as the past is informing the present, is present in Eliot's poem, in its allusion and quotation from Dante. So to sort of draw a bow on some of these observations, here's what these passages and actually one other that I'm not going to read for you tell us from Eliot. The past is a living language in the present, but to be attained by craft, discipline, guild, consciousness. The poet's work as entrance into a vital whole and understood within it is a single new word or sentence articulated in the context of a living language. The past is sufficiently a living tradition rather than a dead one, so much so that the present itself may transform the past. Since I just mentioned how Eliot does this, let me give one quick example from MacIntyre. I don't think anybody in our age could have read Aristotle's Ethics as fruitfully as we can now had they not first encountered the arguments in After Virtue. And we know that because people were reading Aristotle's Ethics and doing it poorly. Whereas after you read After Virtue, suddenly you can return to Aristotle, and MacIntyre, in fact, would advise people to do just this. Forget about him. Return to the ethics and the politics and rediscover those things for the first time. So there are some examples of the tradition. For Eliot, one of the great aims in that essay and elsewhere was to reject the romantic sentimentality theory that art is just about a self-expression of emotion and about an act of originality, and to recover a more profound and true to the history of the practice of poetry, true to the history of the practice of the art, to recover a truer account of that practice. The essay, with its somewhat Mandarin pretensions, exemplifies a kind of seriousness and erudition and authority as the aim. I think this is significant both for good and for ill. For good, because he was pushing back against just that sentimental, self-expressive account of the arts that was coming into being in the early 20th century out of the ashes of Romanticism. but I also think it does something a little bit harmful. What Eliot gives us, and I think to a lesser extent what MacIntyre gives us, is an account of tradition that is very serious, very conscious, and seems very willfully to be trying to do what it does to get by without gratitude. But the thing is, the ideas we associate with tradition, in general, seem all to summon us to gratitude. And here's what I mean by that. I want to share 5 quick ideas with you, all of which are related in some way to tradition. The first one is the account of tradition that I've just been sharing with you. This conscious grasp where the past makes possible the present, and the present is an interaction, a conversation with the past, right? That's the MacIntyre-Eliot theory of tradition. That effectively does eschew all reference to gratitude. I think in MacIntyre's case, that's because he was always very steadfast in avoiding being accused of being a Burkean. That he would have seen Edmund Burke's account of tradition as a slavish gratitude to previously established orders, regardless of their intrinsic goodness. And so he's trying to avoid that. And Eliot's trying to avoid any kind of sentimentality that comes out of not Burke the Romantic, but out of the Romantic poets. But in Joseph Pieper's account of tradition, he takes seriously the idea of traditio as a handing on. And in his early pages of his book on tradition, he speaks of how the tradition must be received. It must be received absolutely uncritically, because it must be just taken and maintained entirely. If you try to fiddle with it, then it's like when a younger brother plays with an older brother's Legos. You're going to break something off and then get beaten up. So you have to just accept it whole, okay? A somewhat more nuanced, provocative account of something like tradition is to be found in the French philosopher Remy Brague's great book, Eccentric Culture, where he introduces as the West's tradition, the European tradition, the principle of what is translated in English as secondarity. It was originally called Romanity, as in of the Romans, but secondarity is actually the more helpful term. And Brague's argument is this: whatever one may say about universals, in the Western tradition, the West is founded on the idea of coming second. You found something, you begin it in second place. What does that mean? Well, the place he looks first is to the Romans. And here's how Brague describes the Romans. The Romans knew they were savage, brutal people who were pretty good at farming. And so they knew they were barbarians. But they looked at the Greeks and they said, these people knew a thing or two. And so the Romans said to themselves, we ourselves are barbarians, but we can become civilized if we allow the Greeks to be our schoolmasters. And so from the beginning, there is this sense of we are the latecomers. We come second. We have to look back to those who come first. And by looking back to those who come before us, we ourselves can become that which we desire to be. They didn't want to be Greeks. They thought the Greeks were too girly, but they wanted to learn from the Greeks to become better Romans. Okay, that happens once. Now, if you look back to the Greeks did the same thing with the Egyptians. Oh, the Egyptians were the first to begin to gather learning and to accumulate things in their temples. Let us learn from them as their school children. So we have Herodotus, for instance, saying that the Greeks got their gods from the Egyptians. And that it was only the Egyptian priests who knew what really happened with Helen at Troy. Homer didn't know. Right? This sense of coming second, and we Greeks can become civilized if we just follow the example of the Egyptians. They didn't want to become Egyptians either, mostly because of their weird shaving habits. But they did want to learn to be mastered by them, to be apprenticed by them. Of course, the single greatest moment in the history of the world of coming second is what happens in Rome when Paul comes. That Rome, the empire, the temporal empire, the eternal city because of Caesar's establishing it for all time. Here's St. Paul this is in the Areopagus, but say, look, we have the truth for you. The Christ has come. And so they look back to this antique and therefore venerable religion of Judaism, and they see the Christ who emerges out of Judaism. And they realize we have to start all over. Our whole effort at theology didn't quite work. Gave us too many gods. Now we can at least, though we're latecomers to it, we can enter into this tradition and know the truth. Okay, so those are the great examples Bragg gives us of secondarity. So to be a member of the West is itself to say, I come second, let me look back to what is first in order that I may finally become myself. This seems to me as if it intrinsically involves gratitude. You would never do that if you didn't say, thanks, Plato. If you didn't say, thank you, St. John, for your gospel. Now I understand how this connects with the Greek logos. These are very important moments. Within that tradition, of course, we have the wonderful Aeneid of Virgil, where we first hear early in the first book of the great moment, or the great term that will define the Roman self-understanding. And that's the one that Dr. Stump shared with us yesterday, pietas. Who are you? Says somebody in the woods. Oh, it's me, Pius Aeneas, says Aeneas. And thus begins a theme, thus begins an epic. The idea of pietas, which is symbolized perfectly by what, I'm going to use the word perfect twice here, what may be the most perfect tableau in all of Western literature. In Book 2 of the Aeneid, when Troy is burning, and Aeneas, having learned from the Greeks, would really love to just go out and kill as many Greeks as he can and die in the flames of Troy. But he is warned against it. He is warned against it by his mother, by Hector's ghost, I forget who else. A lot of reminders. And so he forgoes his death in glory, following the example of the Greeks, to try something new, to try being pious. What does piety look like? He is covered in blood from having fought the Greeks all night, so he asks his father, Ascanius, to pick up the hearth gods, the statues of the hearth gods, and hold them in his clean hands. Then Aeneas himself picks up his father and puts him on his shoulders, and then takes young Ascanius by this hand actually, and walks with them out of Troy into the mountains to seek a new vista. What a perfect image. Pietas as faithfulness, gratitude to God the Father, to one's paterfamilias, the father of one's family, and then leading Ascanius, who will be the future leader of a new city called Rome, fidelity to one's fatherland, one's patria. So there's a very beautiful image of something like tradition that clearly depends internal to itself upon the idea of gratitude. And then finally, a word that we get from the New Testament, although not exclusively, discipleship. I think it's in the Hippocratic Oath, in one of the ancient versions of it, where it says, the medical doctor must love more dearly the one who introduces him to the medical arts than he loves his own parents. So this receptivity and gratitude of the disciple actually is to be a deeper and more demanding bond with one's teacher than are the demands of fidelity for a son or daughter, the parents. We actually see all of these features of tradition with gratitude in Dante's Divine Comedy. First of all, he's writing an epic. That is to say, he's entering into the epic tradition. Is it very different from the epics that precede him? Yes, but no more different really from Virgil's Aeneid than Virgil's Aeneid is from Homer. He models his form on Virgil to roughly the same extent that Virgil models his epic on Homer. And so there's a great sincere form of flattery going on in imitation. And in fact, it's a more honest and thoroughgoing imitation than many of us may give credit for. If you read the Inferno prior to having read Virgil, then the Inferno sounds like a brilliant work of the imagination. That's why it often gets taught to high school students. If you read Virgil before the Inferno, you begin to say things like, well, Dante, I can't wait till we get to Purgatorio so you can start using your own ideas. Because it's very much an elaboration. It's really a kind of commentary on Virgil's Aeneid, Book 6, just as Virgil in the Middle Ages was often referred to as the commentator on Homer, just as Thomas Aquinas will refer to, who is it, Avicenna, as the commentator. It's not Avicenna, is it? Okay. No, Averroes, yeah, Averroes as the commentator. I knew it was wrong. Yeah, I was wrong there. So did in the medieval tradition was Virgil often thought of as the commentator on Homer. This sense of the sacrosanct text and the commentary that adds to it is part and parcel of the theory of secondarity for Brague. And so in thinking of the Inferno as a commentary on the Aeneid, it's no insult to Dante. It's in fact a very accurate way of explaining what Dante would have thought of himself as doing. Needless to say, if these formal tributes to Virgil didn't convince us of Dante's gratitude, we would only have to go through the many, many passages in the comedy where Dante refers to Virgil as his master, my more than father. There are many of them. So there we get pietas and discipleship, master and father. And in fact, someone here heard my lecture on Dante a couple years ago at Magdalen College. You'll know that we could even take another avenue into how pious Dante is regarding Virgil, but that's maybe I'll share that with some of you at lunch. Here's just one passage from the comedy. It's from Purgatorio 30, and it's the moment when Virgil actually disappears. Those of you who know the poem, they enter into the Garden of Eden. Dante has been journeying towards Beatrice. He has now seen her, and he goes to turn back to his more than master, his father, Virgil, to tell him, look, she's here. Here's how it goes. I turned around, and to my left, just as a little child afraid or in distress would hurry to his mother anxiously to say to Virgil, I am left with less than one drop of my blood that does not tremble. I recognize the signs of the old flame. But Virgil had deprived us of himself. Virgil, the gentlest father. Virgil, he to whom I gave myself for my salvation. And even all our ancient mother lost was not enough to keep my cheeks, though washed with dew, from darkening again with tears. He turns to Virgil. I recognize the signs of the old flame. Virgil's not there, but he wants to say that line to him. That, of course, is a quotation from Virgil. Dido, when she falls in love with Aeneas in the Aeneid, says to her sister, I recognize the signs of the old flame. I recognize the signs of love which I had sworn off as Queen of Carthage. But it gets better. But Virgil had deprived us of himself. Virgil, the gentlest father. Virgil, he to whom I gave myself for my salvation. That pattern, Virgil, 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 is a structural syntactical imitation of the fourth Georgic, where Virgil recalls the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. And when Orpheus turns around, thereby losing Eurydice, whom he's come into Hades to save, and she disappears from his sight, just as Virgil has disappeared, Virgil writes, Eurydice, 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 in a similar form to this. So this, gosh, it brings tears to the eyes. This tribute to Virgil is not just material. It's not just saying Virgil, 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 like Marcia, Marcia, Marcia. It's a formal, it inscribes in the form of the poem the act of piety and gratitude. So that even the syntax tells us, I love you. So it speaks of fatherhood, gentility, gift, and of saving of saving. He is the one who saved him. So an absolute dependence on the one who came before to be standing here now. This is tradition conceived as gratitude. If we want an alternative to it, we can find the sort of skin-flinty account of tradition that we get in Eliot that is otherwise so rich, but impoverished of gratitude. But we could look elsewhere. The 20th century literary critic Harold Bloom had his famous anxiety of influence, which was the theory that more or less said this: all poets think they're original prophets. In fact, they're entirely derived from the poets who have come before. And so they deliberately perform an act of misprison, which is a word that he borrows from Shakespeare, but he takes the word and distorts its meaning. It means deliberate misunderstanding, so that they think they're more original than they are, but in fact, they're participants in this visionary company, this romantic genealogy. I was never very tempted by Bloom's account, because before I ever actually read Bloom, I read Wendell Berry. And Wendell Berry said something like, a more adolescent account of the literary tradition could not be conceived. Only an American could have thought of it. It's a very 1950s teenager theory of poetic tradition. Rebel without a cause. Berry then proceeds to attack Huck Finn as just the unhappily quintessential American novel, because it's all to go into Berry speak for just a moment. It's a story of a boomer. He's always going elsewhere. He can't stay put. He's got to get on the raft and go down the river further and further, episode, learning nothing on the way. In contrast, Berry returns back to Dante. Just think of how grateful Dante was, he says, for everything he learned from Virgil. The filial piety is palpable in the poem, and it has no anxiety of influence. I think that that's true. The genius of Bloom was that at least he took tradition seriously. The silliness of Bloom was that, like Eliot, he couldn't just think, maybe we can just be grateful. And that maybe, in fact, gratitude preconditions our ability to enter into the tradition on which we depend if we're to do anything at all. So I'm coming to the end of my time here. I'm going to not read it to you, but in your packets, you would have received just part 2 of Eliot's great poem, Little Gidding, the 4th of the 4 quartets. And it's a passage, in all the 4 quartets, the second part of the poem will have a short lyric, and then the remainder of that part will be almost like a prose commentary. At the still point of the turning world, for instance, in Burnt Norton. And this is Eliot actually imitating, following in the tradition of St. John of the Cross, where John of the Cross wrote his poems, and then all of his spiritual works are prose commentaries on the spiritual works that sometimes leave off because he realizes the poem's too long. But nonetheless, so Eliot does that in Burnt Norton, in all the 4 quartets, with one partial exception, and that's in Little Gidding. In Little Gidding, he gives us a lyric poem, but then instead of getting a very prosaic kind of free verse, we get a very loose imitation of Dante's Terza Rima. It's really just blank verse written in tercets. And so here we have Eliot, who learned so much from Dante, coming as close as he can to writing within Dante's tradition, but to doing so with gratitude. Alas, it was too much for him. And so what happens? The familiar compound ghost, who is simultaneously Dante and W.B. Yeats and Stéphane Mallarmé, and none of them all together, stands there and he says, I will give you 3 gifts, the gifts of age. And the real source for these gifts is none of them. The real source is Michel de Montaigne, who, as you may know, tells us, if you follow the way of nature, you'll go willingly to death when your time comes. But he doesn't say it the way Plato says it, where it's the brave philosopher, and Plato in the Phaedo has Socrates go bravely unto death because he knows that what follows from his death will be better. No, for Montaigne, it's this. If you live long enough, as he had, you'll get kidney stones, your body will decline, you'll lose your sense of taste, even smells will go away. You'll be bored by the 100 millionth rerun of Wheel of Fortune. And so when death comes from you, you say, okay, I was bored, and you'll just go willingly. This is not totally fair to Eliot, but that's roughly the tradition in which he's speaking there. And so even as he comes closest to expressing genuine gratitude to Dante, he has to grasp Dante too consciously. He can't quite be grateful. He has to remain himself the master. So I'm out of time, but I'm just going to share in a sentence each 3 passing counterexamples to this. The first one would be that of Ivor Winters, the great California poet, who, unlike virtually any other poet in the history of American literature, actually gave rise to a whole school of poetry, the Winter Circle. The Winter's Circle. That's not what they called themselves. They denied they were a school of poetry, but they were a school of poetry. If you read Winter's poetry and you read his criticism, which is all marvelous. In fact, he was a non-Catholic Thomist, kind of like Mortimer Adler, but he never converted. And you'll find that the whole riches of the Western and Catholic tradition are found operating his work in a heretical manner, but in a worthwhile manner. And he passed this on to his students, some of whom, like the poet Helen Pinkerton, who just died in 2017, were led by Winter's instruction to enter into the Catholic Church. So he often built better than he knew. But you can always tell a Winter student because there will just be these little ticks in their verse style or in their prose criticism where they show their love of the master. And two of the great Winter's disciples 2 generations on are Timothy Steele, another TS, who I don't have time to share the poem with you, so I won't give it to you. But if you look at his work, you'll feel the gentle gratitude to Ivor Winters percolating through his work. And a poet many of you know would be Dana Gioia. In Dana Gioia's early literary criticism, most of which was written for the Stanford newspapers and literary magazine Sequoia, and none of which has ever been collected, all he wrote about were the different poets who were disciples of Ivor Winters. He wrote about Winter's wife, Janet Lewis, the great literary critic and poet J.V. Cunningham, who was friends with Alistair McIntyre, by the way, and then Edgar Bowers and others. So there's one. Here's just another example that maybe we can talk about another time. That's the Harlem Renaissance poet Claude McKay. In his early, McKay was a native of Jamaica who came to the United States originally to study agriculture, and he discovered that was no fun, so he went to Harlem and loved the city life. And at the same time he made that transition, he ceased writing in Jamaican dialect, which is hard to read aloud with a straight face at our age, but and he started writing in what we would recognize as American, or really the Queen's English. And he wrote mostly sonnets. He's the father of the Harlem Renaissance, and a lot of his poems are on the question of race and racism. And so the material subject of his poetry is actually a grievance against the United States for the racism that he's witnessed in his short time there. But formally, his poetry is entirely one of gratitude. I'll just read this last 6 lines. Bring ancient music to my modern heart. Let fall the light upon my sable face that once gleamed on the Ethiopian's art. Lift me to thee out of this alien place, so I may be thine exiled counterpart, the worthy singer of my world and race. That syntax, that language is all John Keats. All McKay wanted to do was to represent the life of the Black man in modern America, but he wanted to do it entirely within the pious, loving strains of the poets Shakespeare and Keats, from whom he'd learned his art. There's no anguish, it's pure joy and gratitude for the form that they made possible for him. One last one, very short. Richard Wilbur's on having misidentified a wildflower. A thrush, because I'd been wrong about naming a wildflower, burst rightly into song. In a world not vague, not lonely, not governed by me only. And that's the whole poem. So whole poem, it's 4 lines. It's practically, speaking of gloss or commentary, it's practically an epitome or a summary of the great palinode of Socrates in the Phaedrus, where when we learn that we have an immortal soul, a soul that's capable of knowing, we're not therefore to preen ourselves and be proud of ourselves, how great we are, we're all special. Rather, says Plato or Socrates in Plato's dialogue, we're to assume our place in the great hierarchical, ever-circling pageant of being and do what we're called to do as a part within a whole that infinitely transcends ourselves. So Wilbur, recognizing that one can be wrong, is a reminder that there's a world outside of us in which we participate and is not there created by us alone by will or imagination, but rather to which we are called to be receptive and grateful guests and participants. So with that, I'll end. Do we have any time for questions?
Yes,
We do. Okay.
We are open for questions, and thank you very much for that profound and intriguing presentation, especially this gratitude of Dante to Virgil and even of T.S. Eliot to Dante. So the floor is open, and
Okay.
oh.
Oh, yeah. Where did Eliot learn to sign a book? Yeah, I guess I have to answer that. So many novelists in the 19th century would write either anonymously or a pseudonym, the Brontes, for instance. And so when they actually acknowledged their authorship, because the pseudonym was wasn't never a complete disguise, right? It was, people would actually know. They would cross out the name in the pseudonym and write the true author's name in. But even when it's your name now, authors just do it.
Thank you. My name's Catherine. I have a question about a cautionary note I heard about theology and whether you think it has any correlation to philosophy and literature or not. A few weeks ago, I heard a paper by a Dominican named Father Cajetan Cuddy, and he was saying how there in theology we have the sources and we have the commentators. So we obviously have divine revelation, scripture, etc. And then we have a whole tradition of commentary on it. And his cautionary concern was that he thinks today, at least many theologians will get fixated on a particular commentator, but not spend enough time in the source. And so he was warning everyone to make sure that we spend time in the sources of theology and not just focus on what this theologian or that theologian said. And I thought that was wise, but we don't have, I was wondering if there is any sort of caution that we should have about sources and commentators, but we don't have, it's not that the disciplines are the same, and it's not that philosophy and literature have, divine revelation. But do you see any correlation there? Because I thought it was a wise point, at least for the one discipline.
Yes, well, in fact, I think this goes to the heart with why I started with that little meditation on intrinsicism. I think, in fact, formally speaking, this applies to everything. It doesn't just apply to sacred tradition. Sacred tradition creates a new condition in which a truth applies, but it doesn't change the truth. You can't be a good Platonist without knowing Plato. You can't be, you can't be a good philosopher without knowing the tradition and the history of the discipline, which many people do forget and become bad philosophers in consequence. But also, I'd remind us of another word that we heard last night is related to gratitude, but very by a few complicated jumps we have to make, and that's the nature of beauty. that one of the things that the transcendental property of beauty reminds us of is that when something is given to us, it's given to us wholly formed. Scripture, a work of Scripture, Christ himself. And to see the form, we have to receive the form whole. We can't, this is all the language of von Balthasar here. We can't go behind the form as if there were something prior. Form is primordial. The Western tradition, as Bragg describes it in his theory of secondarity, recognized that by insisting on the commentary form. What does that mean? Well, just to stick with Plato for a second, Plato's Timaeus is inviolate. It has its own form. You can't just take parts of it and say, oh, I like these, and leave the other ones on the workshop floor. You have to take the form whole. But you can only take the form whole and yet say something new if you have the technology of the commentary, because the commentary allows the original form to retain its aesthetic shape, its wholeness, even as we enter more deeply into it and discover things within it, even that the text itself may not make obvious on the surface, which is what the whole history of spiritual interpretation does in Christianity. So rather than highlighting theology as a special case, I would actually say it's the paradigm that every intellectual activity actually has to follow. And if it looks unusual to us in our day, that's because we have poorer understandings than we ought to of the other disciplines.
Hi, my name is Bridget. I was just wondering, kind of jumping off of Catherine's question, if there is like kind of the source that we should be, like that all of the commentators, Dante and Homer and stuff, are commentating on, what exactly is that source? Because it seems to me at least that when we look at Western civilization with poetry and philosophy, that we never go farther back than Homer and Plato. Mm-hmm. And so my question is kind of, where did it all begin? And how is it that they even got started?
I wish JJ Sanford was here today, because when I first, the essay I mentioned on poetic traditions on MacIntyre and Eliot that I was summarizing earlier, the first iteration of it was a lecture I gave at the University of Dallas shortly before JJ became president there. And at the conclusion of my remarks, when it was time for questions, he raised his hand and he said, it seems to me as if you're giving too little attention to creativity, to which my answer was, good. The source, it's very common. Jacques Maritain, for instance, does this in Art and Scholasticism in his essay Frontiers of Poetry, to emphasize the crucial difference between making and creation, which I'm sure there are readers of Tolkien in the room. We get this idea of subcreation to describe making. Okay, that's a distinction we make, and it's a just one. But we may make the distinction and then move on from it without taking into account how they actually stand in relation to each other historically. To take a quick digression. In Etienne Gilson's book, The Arts of the Beautiful, he complains about Platonic and Aristotelian accounts of the arts. He says, because the world that Plato constructs for us has no room for making anything new. And he thinks this is a damning criticism. In fact, it's just right. There isn't anything new under the sun. God's the only creator. And every intellectual act, theological, philosophical, or artistic, is a secondary response to the primary gift of being in its beauty or form. And so the first poet's God, and then there's Homer.
Hi, my name is Matt. Could you comment on the relationship between gratitude and imagination? Because it seems like there's this receptivity and giving back in both, and Dante's clearly more imaginative for gratefully receiving Virgil.
Mm-hmm. So that's a tough one. I published an essay a couple of years ago in Forma magazine on the moral imagination, where I was talking about, in part, about Russell Kirk's adaptation of that passage from Edmund Burke. not passage, it's just a phrase, but so the challenge with introducing the word imagination is that when we introduce it, most of the time we're introducing a word that comes out of a very specific German idealist and then broader romantic vision of things that may not always sit coherently with the broader intellectual tradition going back to Plato and Scripture and to God. That said, the word imagination is an incredibly useful term. It's really good to say, if you're a materialist, then you have an impoverished imagination. You just see the world in its constituents as less than it actually is. I think that's a very helpful language. And of course, then the way Coleridge does in connecting the primary imagination, which is just the transcendental aesthetic, as Kant calls it, the vision we have of the world, to the secondary imagination, the act of creating works of art, can be helpful. But I've always been leery of the word imagination, precisely because so much of the work that language tries to do is to stand athwart the idea of receptivity. And it tries to speak of the human mind as itself creative, which is evidently I reject wholeheartedly, even at the risk of never being employable at the University of Dallas. But there is another way in which it's really helpful. And in fact, Plato and Aristotle both have the resources for it. And it takes us back to poetry for a moment. Both Plato and Aristotle tell us that our education begins in music, in hearing rhythms and patterns of both meter and musical rhythm, properly speaking. And that this is formative of the soul, such that in Plato, you certainly can go this far. Aristotle, it's much more in question. You could even say that as Plato conceived the soul, it's entirely underdetermined. It's almost pure potency when it comes into existence. It's not even, properly speaking, ordered to the good. If you're Augustine, you say, I know my soul's ordered to the good, but I don't know what the good is. If you're Plato, it's not entirely clear that the soul, even by its nature, is ordered to the good. And hence the need for education, which he describes in the Phaedrus and elsewhere, in the Republic and elsewhere, planting seeds in the soul. What are those seeds? They're not the good itself, they're images of the good. And so we have to be planted with an imagination so we know what the good kind of looks like, even to begin our quest to seek out the good. And so that's, in that respect, you can say that the imagination does is a very helpful term in the tradition, because it refers to that sort of primordial education that just sets us on the path in the first place, seeking out what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful.
I guess I'm next. Hi, my name is Jim. You stirred up a distant memory for me while you were talking. 30 years ago, I was standing in the Grolier Poetry Bookshop in Harvard Square, reaching up to the top shelf for a copy of one of Eliot's works, and I hear the shopkeeper behind me say, "Oh, another Eliot freak." And I turned around and said, "Yes, I am." One thing I was thinking about as you were talking is poetry is also meant to be heard, and you can all go online and Google 4 quartets read by Alec Guinness, who is himself a Catholic convert. It's there and it's free. The 25th of next month, a DVD of a stage production of Ralph Fiennes reading 4 quartets is coming out, 25th of next month. So I guess my question for you, in kind of light of that hearing of Eliot, is, do you think there's something special about hearing poetry that ushers us into both tradition and gratitude?
Yes, great question. First of all, I must note that I bought my first copy of Ivor Winter's book, In Defense of Reason, in the Grolier Bookshop. Same day I bought Timothy Steele, his disciple's book, Missing Measures, both of which are two of the greatest books of the 20th century. So this touches on gratitude, and it also touches on another subject, which is that all the arts of language are dependent on their existence as speech. And the moment that language as printed is severed in any meaningful way from language as speech, something goes terribly wrong. The art form itself is corrupted, and it enters into decadence. It loses its object, because its object, poetry's object, is to give us give us a printed version of what must be said aloud. So I would just add to the Guinness iteration of 4 quartets is genuinely excellent. It took me a while to appreciate it, in part because I actually think that Eliot's recitation of the quartets is superior. Eliot was the first poet in the 20th century not only to systematically record his voice, but he did many, many, many takes. He was very serious about the what would be preserved. Yes, yeah, they're all on YouTube now. After now I own 3 CDs of Eliot reading, which are now redundant. But it's absolutely essential for the art of poetry that it remain in continuous contact with its origin and destination in human speech. And I think there are several tentacles that come out of here. I'll just mention one of them that's related actually to Eliot's The Wasteland. That is one of the great problems that people have with understanding poetry in our age is they begin reading a text and they have no idea who's speaking. But almost the whole poetic tradition becomes, as in every poem in the tradition, becomes totally lucid and coherent as soon as you say, here's who's speaking. It doesn't take a lot of time to figure out who's speaking in a Shakespeare sonnet, although there are some ambiguities, as you may well know. And for most of the lyric poetic tradition, the basic things we can assume about the speaker remain pretty constant. Most Petrarchan sonnets are love poems, so they're spoken to an unnamed lady or a named lady for that matter. Things get a little more complicated in the 19th century as the subject matter that poetry enters into broadens and widens, and then even more so in the 20th century, where practically any aspect of modern life becomes a legitimate subject for poetry, for a poem. It can take longer to figure out who's talking. Once you do, a poem usually comes alive quickly and everything falls into place intellectually. But until you really know who's speaking, that can be trouble. And of course, what Eliot made a problem for is that if there is a speaker of the wasteland, it's Tiresias, who doesn't even get mentioned until end of part 2, and it's doubtful that that's really him speaking. And if he is speaking, he's just repeating other people's words, and that's just very confusing. So.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I had hoped we would have time still to hear some of your own poems with the connection to gratitude, but we're at the end of this
thank you.
Session, and I thank you for the presentation, and thank the audience for your thoughtful reactions to it. 15-minute break now, and then we continue with the next paragraph.